like to open up the Q&A. I'll go first. Actually, I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about the title of the book, because you use the word myth in there, and I'd like you to sort of elaborate on that a bit further, because most of the time when we hear the word myth in everyday discourse today, people assume that myth means something that is not factual or not historical, and I don't think that's what you're trying to suggest by the use of that. So can you explain why you've got the word myth in the title of your book?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I'm glad you asked, actually. Basically, first of all, the events at Karbala, the Battle of Karbala, is, as you know, Sheikh Alex, is one of the best recorded. In fact, it is the best recorded, as far as I know, event in early Islamic history. I mean, it's without a doubt. So it's not a myth in that way. We're sure that it happened, and in fact, we have a lot of detail about it as a historical event. But in the study of religion, when a narrative takes on communal importance, it becomes expressed ritually. It becomes valued in a certain way. It comes to define a community. Then the shorthand term for that kind of sacred narrative is myth. And it helps us because it helps us place Karbala within the framework of other sacred narratives, other narratives that bring group cohesion, which is where it belongs. You wouldn't study Karbala, let's say, like history of battles. Let's study Karbala and let's study some battle from World War I, right? You wouldn't do that. Because the battle from World War I, we're mostly interested in numbers, things that happen. It doesn't have that sacredness to it. You would study Karbala, the Battle of Karbala, where you might study, battles from the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, or battles from the Hebrew Bible, or battles from Indian philosophy, Hinduism, that talk about a great figure. In these, there's a commonality in that there's more going on there than just the historical events.
So it's almost then. I mean, because I think this is something that often gets missed in when we talk about history today, because there is obviously there's obviously a big concern with what really happened. So, for example, there are debates about how many soldiers were there in the army of Yazid. Was it 7,000? Was it 30,000? Was it 100,000? How many people did Imam Hussein alayhi salam actually kill? Was there actually when was the water actually cut off? And how, for example, there are differing narratives with some of the family members and some of the companions, describing that how did they actually die. But from what I'm hearing you say is almost that these sorts of questions, while valid, miss the point of the story, which is more than an agglomeration of facts and historical accounts, and is actually almost so when we say it's a myth, we mean it's more than history. It's not that it's not historical. It's actually, in this sense, it's more than history, because there is a message attached to this history. There is there is a moral for us to take from it, and that's, in a way, that is equally important, if not more important. I mean, that's the whole purpose of these events taking place, to give us that message. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm exactly. There are. I've seen books, lectures where speakers are sort of sensitive to the historicity of events, and I understand that. I appreciate that. But on the other hand, if you look at even elements of the narrative in some accounts that might not have been historically true, you can still ask the question, why are they there? And what do they tell us? And what does the community get from that? As a whole, though, in the book, I have a chapter that discusses this. I actually think that historicity and the historical factualness of this narrative is an important part of it. That it's you could say a kind of balance. It's a balance between the narrative being true historically, but not being bound by history. That it being true historically, but pointing to and indicating something beyond history, which I call the ahistorical. I'm borrowing that from Nietzsche.
Yeah. So then, I suppose then, if we're talking about historicity and sort of historical accounts, I think it's really interesting. You pointed out that the Battle of Karbala is actually one of the most well-attested events, if not the most well-attested event in early Islamic history. There are numerous eyewitness accounts. It was something that people were desperately interested in from the earliest days, in understanding quite literally what had happened. What had happened at Karbala. How did we end up with so many members of the Prophet's family? In fact, the Prophet's own grandson, being killed so brutally. I mean, people. I mean, when this event happened, it sent shockwaves through the Islamic world, to the point where there was an outcry in there was an outcry in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. When word reached Damascus, even, this is one of, according to some accounts, this is one of the factors that led to Yazid releasing the Prophet's family, that there was such a moral outrage even in the Umayyad capital of Damascus at what had been perpetrated. This is very well attested. But I think what's really interesting is you sort of said there's a balance. I would go further than that. I would say this is possibly one of the most powerful. I mean, we have so many attestations from different historians and thinkers who've come across this history. Whether it's Gandhi, or the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. People sort of come across this and say, you can't ignore this story. This is such a powerful narrative. But on top of that, as well as being this incredible narrative, it's also completely true. This also happened. This isn't a legendary account. This isn't the Shahnameh or the Labors of Hercules, or even biblical accounts of the life of Jesus, for example. It's none of these things. This is a historical event. This is something that happened, that was recorded by eyewitnesses. So it's absolutely true, and it has this powerful message. So it's this fantastic story with this powerful message, and it also happens to be quite literally true. Not true just in the sense of, well, it's true in its meaning. It's true in the morals it's giving us, in the way we might talk about a moral fable, like some of those that you talk about in your work on Sufi virtue and storytelling. But this has a real moral to it, but at the same time, it's a completely factual event that took place. And I think there is almost, the hyper rationalism of the modern world, because we've seen this, right? Sort of the general skepticism with which religion is viewed leads to this poverty of historicity, where we're so focused on pinning down the exact details, to the point where we'll get into arguments about whether it was 10,000 or 30,000 soldiers. And in doing so, perhaps we miss the fact that, well, actually, that's not the most important detail we should be taking from this. So I appreciate your intervention there. Related to that, though, kind of what you were saying about your reading of the Karbala narrative, how would you locate that in relation to, shall we say, the more traditional readings of the narrative, the older Shi'i tradition?
Well, this goes back to the title. When I say the ethics of Karbala, I'm thinking of something very specific. I'm thinking of the study of ethics being related to the word ethos, being related to virtues. And so I think if my book does anything, what I hope it does is take the narrative of Karbala and place it within a context where it can be discussed in university courses on virtue ethics. It can be discussed by those who, let's say, aren't Muslim. They're not. How shall we say? They're not committed to this story in some sort of personal, devotional way, but they can still appreciate why this story and stories like it matter ethically. So that's what I'm hoping the book this does, the book does that those other very important endeavors don't do. The story definitely does matter. It does matter in the story that Imam Hussein is the grandson of God's messenger, and in the Shi'i context, it matters that he is the Imam, the representative of God on earth, right? But actually, the narrative still functions in this very beautiful way if you don't embrace either of those two things. Not in its fullest way, not in the way that it would it does for many during this month when they commemorate it, but in another way. It's worthy of study, in other words. So I'm hoping that's what the book gets across.
Absolutely, and I think that's so. One of the questions which I'll take from the YouTube stream now, and rephrase slightly to fit in with what we were just talking about, is that quite often the rituals surrounding the commemorations of Muharram and Ashura and the sacrifice of Imam Hussein and his family and companions alayhim salam at Karbala, to people who aren't part of the Shi'i tradition, it can be difficult to understand, even for other Muslims. Although I'd just like to note that traditionally, for hundreds of years in the Islamic world, it was very common for Sunnis to commemorate Imam Hussein right up to the modern, and many still do. Incidentally, it's just something that has been suppressed in recent years but this is something that Sunnis also recognize. But I think even for our Sunni brothers and sisters, it can sometimes be difficult to understand what's going on. But then for non-Muslims now, going even further afield, for non-Muslims, it can be utterly incomprehensible. And sometimes I think almost more harmfully, it can be exoticized and orientalized in the way we sort of see that the focus on the ritual, the rituals of mourning, while overlooking the message. I mean, I think I've lost count of the number of documentaries on the history of Islam that when they talk about Sunnism and Shiism, they mention Karbala as if the Sunnis were on the other side of this, and that this is the origin of the split. It's like no, Sunnis and Shias are both firmly in the camp of Imam Hussein alayhi salam when it comes to this. But I think for outsiders, they sort of see they see Shia mourners dressed in black, they see the alams, they see the latmiya, they see the crying and the strong emotions, but that message doesn't necessarily come through. And I think one of the challenges in the West, and this is something that I remember has been going on for at least 2 decades, for at least 20, for as long as I can remember. There have been efforts to sort of to make the message of Imam Hussein accessible to non-Muslims or to people who aren't Shias. And we've seen campaigns. So, for example, everyone's heard of Who is Hussein? So, they distribute leaflets and organize campaigns sort of around Muharram and Ashura time, so that to explain what's going on. There have been other examples too. There was a very famous documentary that was done in the early 2000s by Red Tears Productions. So there have been lots of attempts to sort of present Muharram in a way that is more that is more accessible to others. I was wondering, like, from your perspective, and I feel that your book as well could be seen as fitting, fitting within this. And I know that there are some other initiatives going on, especially in North America, sort of, I think at Harvard as well, as there is there's been a program this year on Muharram and Imam Hussein. So I would sort of situate your book almost as an intervention in this tradition, in this sort of current within modern Shiism, which is to try and make this message of Imam Hussein universally accessible. But I'd love to hear, what are your thoughts on this? How do we build on what you've identified here, which is this universal message that anyone can access? And also, I want to sort of throw in a flip side there. How do we avoid this just becoming watered down to something that is simply, a liberal platitude, which we've seen. So, for example, with there's a very good book on sort of the commercialization of spirituality. I think it's called Buying Buddha and Selling Rumi. And the idea that sort of you can take these great spiritual traditions, strip them of everything that makes them unique, and reduce them to something that's essentially, feel good and therapeutic. Like, so how do we make the message of Imam Hussein accessible to people of other faiths or no faith at all, based on human values without somehow reducing that message?
Well, that's a great question. Um, One thing I would suggest, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier, Sheikh Alex, about the those who, let's say, the remembrance of Imam Hussein used to be part of their cultural traditions and now is not, right? Well, what is that person very often thinking? What they're thinking is that there's a circle of things that they'll call Islamic, and this falls outside of this circle. It just doesn't look right, right? And we can all suffer from that, where we create a circle, and in this circle is what we think is Islam, of being Islamic, and or being good, or being allowed, or being proper, and everything outside of that is not. And I think one of the things that we should all be doing is kind of looking at that circle and seeing how justified it is. Can it be expanded? Can things be included that aren't? And that includes Shi'i Muslims too. I'll give you an example, and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but I saw this once, where a group wanted to undertake a march, and it was a march for commemorating Imam Hussein through a certain city, downtown. I won't mention which city; it doesn't matter. An English-speaking city, let's put it that way, where most of the residents spoke English. That's what matters. So they took this march downtown, but very little of what they did was in English. And there were people there who were willing to recite poetry in English. There were people there who were willing to do a lot of things in English, where this marching downtown wouldn't have looked like people wearing black who are angry about something or sad about something. They came and they left, and we have no idea what happened, right? And maybe in some imaginary world, what you're hoping is someone will say, "Oh my gosh, what is that?" and come ask you about that. Well, sure, but why not just tell them? Like, why create these barriers where they have to come and beg you to understand what you're saying, right? I mean, the Quran was revealed in Arabic, it says, so that the audience would understand it. It seemed to me that maybe like that would be something where the circle can be expanded. Expand that circle. It might not feel right for people who are commemorating Imam Hussein to have a lot of poetry in English. A lot of the centers, they say, "Oh, it doesn't hit me right. It's like emotionally, right? If I hear it in language X, Y, or Z, it means something. This English stuff is not." And so if they do it, they might like, here's the 5 to 7 year old children. They're going to come up and recite a poem in English, because that's who the English language is for. Well, if the message is important, you might want to consider expanding the circle, right? If you're living in an English-speaking country, majority English-speaking country, similarly, if you're in a place where there's English and Spanish speakers, maybe have something in Spanish too. We get caught in these circles too. Everyone does, where what's right and normal is this. Well, be open-minded. That would be one thing. This has nothing to do with the book. This has to do with me and my experiences and just sharing. But that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very valid point you made, and it's quite interesting how you took that. And you said we need to expand those circles, and I wasn't expecting you to sort of mean language by that, but I think that's very true. That we sort of think that the commemoration of Imam Hussein has to be done in a certain way, in a certain format, and we forget, of course, that there was a time. Although when I think about the main languages that we commemorate Imam Hussein alayhi salam in now, aside from English, it's Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. Of course, we forget that there was a time when no one was commemorating Imam Hussein in Urdu, and there was a time when no one was commemorating Imam Hussein in Farsi. And I can almost hear the howls and objections of some of my Iranian brothers to that. But there was a time when this was something that was taking place primarily in Arabic, and then over time, we had it started to happen in Persian. And then over time, it started to happen in Urdu and other local languages. There had to be a process of translation, and that's actually how Shiism spread. That's how the message of Imam Hussein spread, because people would have, heard the story and wanted to know more. And I think that's true. I think that's not just true about Imam Hussein alayhi salam. I think it's true about the teachings of all the Ahlul Bayt and the teachings of Islam as a whole, that this all took place through, through people translating their experiences to a new language. And we need to be open to doing that too. So I think that's a really valuable contribution.
Yeah.
Now the next, I think I want to shift gears now and take another question from our audience. So I think there's a really good question here on how do you think the Imam's ethics impressed people outside his family who joined him on the journey, and some who actually, some like Hur, for example, who literally only joined him in the last hours. How can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Definitely, yeah. Because this comes up in the book, so that's easier for me to. It's very easy for me to respond to. So, one key example you mentioned, the person asking the question, a great question, by the way, mentions Al-Hur. Hur is such a beautiful case of this, because what Imam Hussein does in the narrative, in his meeting, is he can be rough with Al-Hur because he's trying to wake him up, in the narrative. But at the same time, he shows Al-Hur, and he shows that side of the camp, this caring, loving approach that I've been talking about. Famously, he provides water to the enemy at this point when they meet. But of particular importance for me is one episode where there's a man there who he is so thirsty that he's kind of fumbling with the water skin. He can't drink it. And Imam Hussein not only helps him, there's a point where the man doesn't really understand what Imam Hussein is saying because of the language barrier. And Imam Hussein is very gentle with him and careful with him. And he gives him water and gives the horse water. I think that gentleness, that love, that care, that compassion, right? That brings people to come and approach the world that way. And that's the only way you can understand the story of Imam Hussein, right? That's the only way you can understand what was happening at Karbala. And that's the only reason, that's the only way that Al-Hur wakes up. He wakes up, of course, he realizes who Imam Hussein is. He knew that from the beginning, but he's thinking about it now. But he also sees the character, and he sees the beauty of this man, right? So I think that's an important part. Of course, anyone will tell you that ethical perfection is very difficult to happen in a short amount of time. So there's always something that you have to look into someone's past to see why they have become what they've become, right? You can see people transform quickly, but there's always a chain of other events behind it in their life that you'd have to know about to see that development.
And of course, for every Hur, there is not only an Umar bin Saad, there's thousands of other people who simply followed orders, who did as they were told. And I think that's that's the striking thing about the example of Hur and the few others who switched sides. I mean, they were it's evident that it was Imam Hussein's moral character, and just the fact that this man was so evidently a living saint, for want of a better word, that he was just the epitome of goodness, and it made them deeply uncomfortable that anyone would wish to do him harm, that there could be any justification for harming such a person. And I think the contrast is always drawn where Imam Hussein alayhi salam gives water to the to Hur and his soldiers when they meet, but then Hur becomes very uncomfortable with the fact that Umar bin Saad and his soldiers are then preventing Imam Hussein from getting water. And we sort of see this, by the way, this isn't just with Imam Hussein, and we see this with the Prophet salawatullahi alayhi, and we see this also with Imam Ali. So at the Battle of Siffin, for example, when Imam Ali's forces controlled access to the river, they allowed the soldiers of Muawiyah to come and obtain fresh water. But then when Muawiyah's soldiers took control of the river, they refused to do the same. And then when Imam Ali took back the river again, again they allowed Muawiyah's soldiers to access it. So I think there is this. You're right. There is this sort of this ethical character at work. It's not just a code, as you know. I'd like us to come back to that, actually, if you permit me, because I'd love to hear more. Because if I understood what you were saying, it's the idea that noble character begets noble actions, and you explicitly held that up in contrast to the idea of there being a moral code that someone has to to follow. So could you elaborate a bit more on that? Like how does sort of this idea of nobility of character producing noble actions, it's almost as if you're saying that not that there are no rules, but that this isn't an ethical system that's dictated by following rules. It's something that comes from within the imam themselves, and indeed from within his followers. So it almost goes, again, if we can sort of parallel between history and myth, it goes beyond the rules to just goodness flowing out of the person, even when there are no rules to follow, even when there isn't a rule to follow.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you're doing the right thing time after time because you're following rules and not because it somehow emanates from who you are, then I think you have to ask yourself the question, have you really, who are you? Are you really a decent person? Are you really a noble person or not? I mean, look, have you ever, I'm sure you have, Sheikh, you've seen the case made, believe it or not, for the side of Yazid. And if you look at the case made, it's that, well, he was the caliph of the time, and you should obey the caliph of the time. And what people will often do when they want to counter this argument that Imam Hussein should have obeyed the caliph of the time, so he was in the wrong. It's like, they'll get into this whole long, let's go back to Ghadir Khum. Like, okay, hold on, time out. Do you need to go that far? Do you need to prove that Imam Hussein was, let's say, the imam of his time to prove that what Yazid did was wrong? No. How do we know that? By the plethora, the large number, the mounds upon mounds of Sunni authors who not only agree with Imam Hussein on this issue, but commemorate him. I think most of the accounts of Imam Hussein that I use in the book are from Sunni authors, by the way. Not just today, but in general. And not because I'm trying to make a point, but just because it's really good history writing. And you'll find really no difference between Sunni writers and Shi'i writers when it comes to the Maqatil on these issues. It's a historical event, and they agree with him. I'm saying, why? Not because they say, oh, he was the living imam from the Shi'i theological perspective, but because they're able to see big picture Islam. And that's what I think the supporters of Imam Hussein did. That's what I think was happening on that day. That's what Hur, Al-Hur is a soldier, right? And the soldier has a way of looking at things. And in a soldier's life and in a soldier's mind, you obey the command and so on and so forth. But to be able to step back and see what's really happening and to see the big picture, right? See who this man is, see what he stands for, see what the enemy wants and what the enemy stands for. I think that's at the heart of the message there, right? And that kind of big picture thinking, that kind of taking everything into account is, we might call it, a kind of wisdom that comes from, manifesting the virtues in your life. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something, again, going back to the fact that the sacrifice of Imam Hussein is something, so there's been traditionally commemorated by, Sunni authors. I mean, we forget that some of the most beautiful poetry written in Persian about Imam Hussein actually, in fact, came from authors who were nominally, Sunni. I mean, everyone, there's the famous couplet. I think it's from Shah Wali Allah Dehlawi, Dinast Hussein. Hussein is the religion. It's like and he says that he gave his head before he would give his hand to the tyrant Yazid. And I think that's that's something that we we can focus on. And I think that the explanation you gave there of why Imam Hussein's message resonates beyond the confines of Shiism, but to all Muslims, and I think indeed to all fair-minded people who come across this story, is that it's the fact that this is just so obvious. This is so obviously not just a righteous person, but a good person, a kind person, a person who has done nothing wrong to anyone and is simply standing up for what is right at a time when no one else will. I mean, I don't need to tell you, Umar ibn Sa'ad isn't a nobody. He's the son of the famous hadith narrator Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. Abdullah ibn Umar was alive at this time. One of the most prominent early hadith scholars, and he just sort of sat this one out. He didn't, he didn't get involved. And so this was a time when really sort of many of the best and brightest of the Islamic world were sort of sitting quietly while Yazid took the Pledge of Allegiance. And, bearing in mind this Pledge of Allegiance was one taken at the point of swords. And Imam Hussein really was the only person saying, this isn't okay, and I'm not going to endorse this by pledging allegiance. And he's quite explicit about that as well. I mean, you mentioned him trying to avoid conflict. Not only does he refuse to strike the first blow or fire the first arrow, he's at every moment he's offering sort of ways out of a battle. He's saying, look, if you've changed your minds, he says to the army, you are the ones who wrote letters to me. If you've changed your mind, I'll go home. And, if that's not okay, well, then I'll leave the lands of Islam. I'll go and live somewhere else.
Let me go to India. That's an interesting one. That's an interesting one. Yeah, he says. I mean, that was fascinating when I read that. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to say, if you've read the I don't speak Urdu myself, but having read the Urdu poems, the translations of the Urdu poems, sort of written in honor of Imam Hussein, you can kind of understand why he wanted to go to India. He must have known that some of his most devoted followers would be there. And then he says, okay, and if that doesn't work, if you're not happy with that, then I'll talk to Yazid myself. Let's go. We'll resolve this between ourselves. But I'm not pledging allegiance here today to this man. And of course, it's Umar ibn Sa'ad and Shimr and the army of Yazid who are saying, well, no, you're not leaving here alive unless you pledge allegiance. Whereas Imam Hussein is the one who's trying to avoid conflict. Let's take another question from our audience though, and this is a really interesting one. Someone has asked: is freedom an ethic or a trait? Can you expand more on the state of freedom upheld by Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his family and companions, and the lessons we can draw from them?
That's a very good question too. I didn't think about the question of whether it's what we call like a virtue or a more general trait. But we could definitely say that it's a way to describe the Karim, the noble person, right? And in a lot of these texts, it's also a synonym for the noble person. So, and that's
why as well. Just to interrupt.
Yeah.
Why Imam Hussein, his last words to Hur before Hur expires is, "You are as your mother named you, free in this world and free in the next." This idea of it's very poetic. That Hur basically lived up to his name.
Yes,
the free man.
Exactly, 100%. Yes. But that's, I get into this again with this contrast between Al-Abbas and Harmala at the end of chapter 3. What does it mean to be free as a warrior, right? The camp of Imam Hussein, you could say they never compromise on their principles, but you can also say they are always authentic to themselves. This is who I am. And they say it so often. Look at me. This is who I am. This is my lineage. This is my imam. Take it or leave it. You want to kill me? Kill me. But this is who I am, right? On the other side, you don't see that kind of freedom, right? It's hierarchy. It's order. It's fear. It's suppression. And it's fascinating to me that we could tie that to being ignoble, right? That we could say, you're not free. You're acting like an enslaved person here. mentally enslaved. You're not mentally free. You're not psychologically, emotionally free right now, right? When you can't give water to a baby, right, you're not free. But we can tie that to a vice. We can say you are not. That is different from being noble. So I think that's to me. It's a fascinating way of looking at the events of Karbala, right? Because the narrative calls you to a kind of freedom, right? And that's why I mentioned in the beginning what was said to be inscribed on the sword of Imam Hussein. Because being free can be in the smallest things. If you're bound by envy, if you're bound by covetousness, if you're bound by, these are smaller ways of not being free in your life.
I think that's a very nice way of putting it. Small ways of not being free in your life. Small. Yeah. And I think as well, if we do look at the narrative, as you said, it's always Shimr who's telling the soldiers, who's kind of goading the. It's like, the number of times you see Shimr in the narratives basically yelling at Umar ibn Sa'd's troops to get on and do their jobs. It's clear that the majority of the army don't want to be there. They don't really want to be fighting Imam Hussein, but they simply lack the nobility and therefore the freedom to do otherwise. And Shimr is the one who's yelling at them, like, you've pledged allegiance, follow your orders, do as you're told. And you never see Imam Hussein telling his. In fact, you see the opposite from Imam Hussein. On the eve of Karbala, he's the one telling his followers, like, look, they're going to kill me. You don't all have to die here. You should all leave. He's trying to avoid getting all of his followers killed, for his sake. And his followers, and isn't it beautiful though that his followers are literally free to go, as in no one would stop them leaving. Imam Hussein wouldn't blame them for leaving, and yet they choose to stay. And doesn't that just exemplify this idea of the nobility and freedom that you've so beautifully kind of laid out for us?
And on a social historical level, while we might see this as something specific to Imam Hussein and his followers, on a social historical level, I think it points to a different model of warfare than what's starting to emerge. Let's not forget that the Islamic imperial expansion, for the most part, happens on the backs of not just after paid soldiers, enslaved soldiers. People aren't aware of this. If you listen even to a lot of sort of Islamophobic pundits and things like that, well, they'll talk about jihad as having something to do with Islamic expansion. Actually, very few of the campaigns of Islamic expansion were formally declared as something jihad or anything like that. They were mostly either paid or then, for the most part, enslaved soldiers. Your average Muslim was kind of not involved, right? What does that say? This is a different model than the original model that the Prophet Muhammad and Imam Hussein had, where your loyalty is to the person as a moral exemplar, right? And by the way, who really discusses this beautifully is Ibn Khaldun. He does a wonderful, wonderful discussion of this shift in Muslim society. So,
yeah, that's right. That he does look at that shift away from the early Islamic virtues to sort of this institutionalized
precisely.
Almost in a way, I think was it Durkheim who spoke about the shift away from charismatic authority to sort of formalistic legal authority, right?
Weber, yeah.
Weber, sorry, yeah, not Durkheim, Weber. That's right, yeah. And so Ibn Khaldun got there first, though, with his.
Yeah.
But I think though when we look at the story of Imam Hussein, for example, you mentioned the quote, the likes of me, mithli, does not give allegiance to the likes of Yazid, mithlu. It's almost as if, and you use the term model, but I would maybe take it a step further. I would say we're almost dealing with something that is archetypal here, that this is being, these figures are, even though these are historical figures and these are historical events, I mean, this is one of those cases where, there are, it's almost, this is an event, these are events of cosmic significance. because they represent not just two diametrically opposed models, but two diametrically opposed archetypes of what it is to be a human being. On the one hand, you have, the free human, the noble human, represented by Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his followers. And then on the other hand, you have, fear and control and authority and tyranny, and the ignoble human, the enslaved human. And by the way, I think it's really important when we say enslaved, like in the case of the soldiers of Umar ibn Sa'd and the soldiers of Yazid, they were voluntarily enslaved. They allowed themselves to be enslaved. That they were also there by choice, but they convinced themselves that they didn't have a choice. They allowed themselves to be almost, to be told that you have to do this, whether you like it or not. You have to follow orders. But I wonder off the back of that, because obviously the Umayyad Caliphate is no more. Yazid is no more. Well, I mean, it's not that he's no more, and I hope that wherever he is, he's suffering terribly. But he's no longer in this world. But what then is the relevance? Now, obviously, it's very easy to map, to map the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam onto contemporary events. But what I want to ask is, though, that in terms of our day-to-day lives, because there are obviously geopolitical events going on now where the similarities are undeniable. The fact that these archetypal forces are at work in the world. But I'm more interested in terms of our everyday lives. If there was one way in which we could be more like Imam Hussein when we're making, because people forget that as you said, you sort of mentioned this with Hur, that in order to see why it was Hur that changed, you sort of have to almost have this genealogy, this moral and spiritual genealogy of his life. I think people often imagine that, everyone talks about, sort of Imam Hussein and Karbala and Ashura, and everyone thinks that sometimes making that moral choice means that you have to be in this epic battle between good and evil. And it's, and that's what being virtuous is, that's what being moral is. And I think we overlook, you said this, because you said the small ways in which we are not free. Can you talk about, would you be comfortable speaking about some of the small ways in which we can be more free as individuals, be more moral as individuals, and be more like Imam Hussein as individuals?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. But I mean, in essence, a lot of it isn't new, right? So much of what leads a person to being morally free, noble, it's not going to surprise anyone. Loyalty, honesty, right? And you think about the opposites that are on the sword, right? Envy, covetousness, a lot of it. But then what happens is that with a kind of consistency in practice, in times of great conflict or pressure or stress, in times when a person can do right or do wrong, suddenly everything that you've been practicing, everything that's been kind of a part of who you are, becomes much more important. It escalates. That's what makes war so significant. It's not that war is a good thing. War is horrible. It's not that we're by talking about warriors, we're hoping that there will always be war. War should end now. There should never be war ever again, right? But the reason why we focus on wars is because wars are moments of heightened significance in the course of human events, where the decisions that we make become more important, the sacrifices we make become more extreme. The people that we hurt are more hurt than they would be in under normal circumstances. So, I'll give you an example of a way in which sort of short-term changes sometimes don't last. It's kind of a funny story, but I'll say it. A friend of mine went to the Hajj, and he went from America, and he was telling me about the people that were with him, because there were some of them who they had been putting off the Hajj for like decades, and they weren't really practicing Muslims. But what amazed him was when they were at the Kaaba and they saw the Kaaba, their tears were streaming from their eyes. He said he described them like angels. And he said they had this sudden change while they were there. But what struck him even more was that on the bus on the ride back, they were driving to Jeddah, and the bus had taken off in the middle of the night, or late in the night, close to the early morning, so that they were going to have to drive right through Fajr prayer. And this friend of mine starts to protest. He tells the bus driver, "Listen, just pull over. I have to pray Fajr. Please just pull over for 1 minute." And those same people that he had seen crying and angelic and all that were like, "No, just keep going." And one of them said to him, "The Hajj is over," right? So what I mean by that is, I don't mean to put anybody down or anything, but what I mean to say is that there are sudden transformations a person can make, but the kind that last and the kind that are meaningful usually have to do with what's built on over a long, long period of time, right? That's what's amazing about the story of Karbala, is that if you go into each of those people, and their lives have been recorded quite well, and there's books, there's entire books that they'll tell you each chapter will be on one of the companions of Imam Hussein, right? And you look at it, there's always more to the story than what happened in the days preceding Karbala. There's always more to the story when you're looking at the person's life, and it's not what you expect. So someone could have been not with the camp of Imam Ali before these events, ideologically opposed, but there's something in that person's life that made them stand with Imam Hussein at the very end, right? And you have to figure out what it was. You can't just say, "Oh, it was this moment," because if it's this moment, it's not that meaningful. You have to look at what was being built.
That beautifully put. And I think also, we see examples of other people in their, in their lives as well. They're surrounded by good people. Like, I'm trying to think, was it Zuhair ibn al-Qayn who when he met Imam Hussein on the way, and he was traveling with his wife, and he was sort of mulling this over at whether he should join Imam Hussein.
He was trying to avoid him.
He was trying to avoid him, and then in the end, he was sort of, yeah, that's right. He was trying to avoid him, and then eventually they ended up at the same rest station. Despite Zuhair's best laid plans to get out of, being, I sort of think of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn as a bit like Han Solo, this reluctant, heroic figure, who's sort of trying, because he knows what he's going to do if Imam Hussein speaks to him, and then. I love the fact that sort of Imam Hussein sends word for him to, come sit down. I need to talk to you. And Zuhair is sort of like, he doesn't want to go. And it's his wife who actually turns to him and says, "The grandson of the Prophet just asked you to go and talk to him. Go and see what he wants." And I think, I feel that there's so much we get wrong about our view of ethics and heroism and virtue in the modern world, because we sort of have this very individualistic view of it. And I think, there's an element of sometimes it's also being a virtuous person means surrounding yourself with virtuous people. It's like, you sort of see on, you have all these Instagram videos about success, and like, you have to surround yourself with successful people. Well, that's true. You have to surround, but then how do you define success? And if we're defining success as fundamentally being a good person, then we should be surrounding ourselves with people who want us to be good too, and who we want, it's sort of mutually supporting. And so I think we see that sort of in cases of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn and others, where they're not just individual heroes. There is a whole community of people around them, or a network of people around them, or a circle of people around them that promotes their virtue, whether it's their spouses, whether it's their children, their parents, their friends. And I think that's something that's I think that's something that's beautiful in those stories as well. So we're very short on time, and I feel like you and I, Professor Zargar, we could go on all day. So I want to get one or two final questions from the audience. So this is quite an interesting one. Like, what is your view on Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam going into the water and taking the water in his hand, and then as if to speak to the water directly, rather than simply stopping at the edge of the bank, because there is this, there is the famous account where Hazrat Abbas sort of almost plunges into the river and is, and is portrayed sometimes as being on the verge of drinking, but then saying, no, I won't drink. And we actually have a similar one of, Imam Hussein, when he's, portrayed as being on the verge of drinking, then someone says, oh, you're going to drink water while your family are thirsty, and then he throws the water away. Like, how are we to understand these narratives? Like, what is the message here?
I think one of the fascinating things about that account is, much of what I've studied before I studied before I wrote this book, was Sufism. If you go to Sufi texts, you'll see that there's this idea that love undoes all arguments, right? That love can basically, everything you know and understand about the world, love can devastate it, right? Now, if you look at, what Al-Abbas is doing at that moment, right? I mean, there wouldn't be anything wrong with drinking the water. I mean, you could even make an argument that it would make him better able to come back, or stronger, or there are all kinds of rational arguments you can make. But in the domain of love, right? How could he? How could he, knowing that they're thirsty and that Imam Hussein's thirsty? That's what I mean. There's a kind of I think a way to read this narrative, and people have. It's something new, where they're reading it through like Sufi poetry. If you've noticed, very often people will read a few baits from Maulana Rumi or Hafez in the Persian tradition before they read about Imam Hussein, showing you that this connection between being sort of losing oneself in love is the way to understand this narrative. Now, unfortunately, in my book, I could only touch on that because you can only do so many things. But I was very impressed by the writings of Muhammad Iqbal. I mean, Iqbal really, really takes this issue, and he does it from the perspective of Sufism. He really gets into the narrative of Imam Hussein from the perspective of love in a very analytical, beautiful way, by the way. If anybody wants to look at it, I mean, it's good.
Wow, that's quite a recommendation. I think that's a lovely way of looking at it as well, like seeing this as a story. I mean, there is so much love in the story of Imam Hussein. There's tragedy as well, but that tragedy is that. I mean, we forget that the tragedy and the grief that exists because the primary feeling there is one of love and loyalty. I mean, when Imam Hussein's companions on the eve of Ashura, proclaim to him, even after he's told them to sort of depart and to seek safety, that they'd rather be, cut to pieces and brought back, and cut to pieces and brought back, and cut to pieces and brought back, before they, and they still wouldn't leave, no matter how many times they went through that. I mean, if that isn't love, I don't know. I don't know what to call it. I don't know what love is if not that. That sort of that utter devotion that we see from Imam Hussein's family and followers towards him, that even when presented with a way out, it just makes them want to stay more. It almost as if it confirms to them that they were right to love this man in the first place. That he's because he's given them that. Because anyone else would say, yeah, I need to keep my followers around me. I need protection. I'm vulnerable here. But Imam Hussein is sort of telling you, it's like, go. They want me. They don't want any of you. And that almost confirms in their mind that they were right to love, because that's the act of a truly noble person. Final question, then we must end. So, the murder of Imam Hussein alayhi salam is obviously very painful for us, and it seems that this murder, his sacrifice was inevitable, given the fact that he was refusing to pledge allegiance to Yazid. But then the question arises, the capture and imprisonment and maltreatment of the women and children of the Prophet's household, could that not have been avoided by sending them back with Hazrat Abbas, for example, alayhi salam, and some helpers? Like, why do you think, and both in terms of history, but also in terms of the story, why does it make sense that the women and children had to go into captivity? Why did they have to go through that hardship?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, it's a question that's probably best answered by historians of Karbala, and they exist. Some really careful historians who You can even see maps where they'll show you what took place, where it took place in great detail. And those would be the people you'd want to ask that kind of question to. And I'm ashamed to say I'm not one of them. I just had this kind of, approach through moral philosophy that I was thinking of it. But I mean, it would seem to me that probably whoever wasn't killed would have also been taken captive. It seems to me they didn't have the resources for the journey back. So it's not like you can just go, you have to have the resources with you to go back. But they had been cornered and kept there for so long that they didn't have those kinds of resources for someone to come and take them, and nor would they have been allowed to. I think that it seems to me that Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad's purpose was humiliation. So he wouldn't have, let's say, let someone take the camp back and left that person without having his army go out and, stop them. He wanted to parade them through Kufa. That was a part of what he wanted to do. Of course, as we know historically, that did not end well for him at all. He wasn't prepared for the Alawi rhetoric of Zainab, as Tahir Qutbuddin has beautifully, by the way, discussed. Highly recommend. She's really gotten into Zainab's rhetorical skills, right? Amazing. So he wasn't prepared. What's that?
To the point where Ibn Ziyad even said that, you speak like your father.
Precisely, yeah. I mean, and the fact that we have a study in English of that is amazing. He wasn't prepared for that. Now, maybe if you want to look at it from a divine wisdom perspective, this was all a part of some great divine plan. I don't get into that kind of thing. But I just doesn't seem like it would have been possible. And let me also... I want to respond to one of the things as we're ending right now. I just want to respond to one of the things that you were saying before about love. And this gets to what the book does, right? My book presents Karbala ethically, but I hope no one walks away with that with a sense of me saying that that's what other people should be doing, that the way Majalis is held is that the whole purpose of Karbala was just to teach us ethics. So let's cease this emotive side of what we do. Actually, Professor Hassan Ali, he really, he and I had a wonderful conversation about this, and he reminded me as well how important the emotive part of this is. And suffice it to say, and I'll end on this, that I can't remember where Allama Tabatabai says this, but Allama Tabatabai says that two things open up your eyes in the spiritual realm. He says this, reading the Quran and remembrance of Karbala and Imam Hussein. Now, obviously, that's not something that I can study and put in this book, right? That doesn't mean but that doesn't mean that we should somehow that invalidates it. I mean, that in fact means that there's so many dimensions to this narrative that we shouldn't limit it and say that it is either this or that. It's this and that. It's the emotional part, which links to the spiritual part. It's the ethical part, right? It's all of these things at once. And I don't think we should deprive the narrative of any of these just because we're studying one. I just wanted to make that clear so that there wasn't any confusion.
No, I think that's a really important point, that just because we're studying a figure or a narrative or a doctrine from one perspective, that doesn't mean that we're invalidating all of the other perspectives on that, or meaning that we're saying that this is the only way to look at it. And I think that's a perfect. I was going to ask you if you had any final thoughts, but I think that does it beautifully. And thank you so much. No, thank you so much for that. It's been a genuine pleasure having you with us, Professor Zargar, and thank you for sharing, a few snippets from your book. I would encourage everyone to go out and get a copy. I think it's available now through most booksellers now online. And it would be wonderful actually if we could have you back when you do your next book as well, which I'm sure given how many books that you've published in recent years, I can't imagine that would be too long.
God knows. But I do need to thank you for having me and giving me time to talk about something that's very important to me, something I've spent time working on, and to share these ideas with others, for having this platform, and really for engaging with the ideas in such depth. So thank you, Sheikh Alex, and to the rest of those that I care. I am grateful. There's a note here about where people can get the book.
Yes.
Everywhere. Amazon. It's published by Routledge, the Routledge website, but the online, the booksellers, they all have it. Also, look, the book at this point is kind of pricey. Don't underestimate libraries. I mean, just if you just want to read it, there's all kinds of places you can get it.
So support your public library.
Yeah. University libraries for sure should have it soon. It might take a few months, but they'll have it later.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And final question from me: what now? What are you going to be working on in the future?
Well, I'm going back to Sufism. Really, I've been working on a book which I haven't defined it yet, but I'm very involved right now in thinking about dreams and dreaming from a Sufi perspective. Now, I don't know where that's going to go, because the first part of this project had to do with the Quran and thinking about the language of the Quran from the perspective of theoretical Sufism. The book is yet undefined, but it will probably be somewhat of an introduction to Islam through key ideas from what I would call theoretical Sufism. So I wish I could define it further, but even I don't know what it is yet.
Perhaps it will come to you. Perhaps it will be revealed to you in a dream.
That would be great, but I doubt
it. Would be great.
Yeah, maybe. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper. I just kind of go to sleep and wake up. That's
oh, that sounds delightful. But thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me
and sharing your research with us and giving so generously your time and answering our questions. I think I speak from everyone here when I say that we've learned so much from having you with us today, Professor Zargar, and we can't wait to have you back again in future. Actually, for those of you who want more of Professor Zargar's talks, he also delivered a really good paper at the conference. So if you look on our YouTube channel, I think it was in the first session of the first day, so it will be panel number 1 on our YouTube channel. You can find his you can find his talk there, where he spoke about Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam and embodied knowledge, and I think that was definitely one of the highlights of the conference from me. And I'm not just saying because you're here with us. I'll say that behind your back as well.
Appreciate it.
So just to wrap up now, I just want to thank thank you, Professor Zargar, once again. I also want to thank the fantastic team here at the International Center for Advanced Islamic Research.